During the second wave of feminism that emerged in the 1960s and 1970s, the women's liberation movement built up steam once again. The African American civil rights movement of the previous decades inspired the second wave of feminism in the United States. However, this movement was not restricted to the United States, as it also extended to Latin American countries, Canada, and Europe. It was different from the first wave of feminism, which was concerned mainly with granting women the legal right to vote. The first wave was successful to that end. However, during the second wave, feminists went a step further by advocating in favor of various social issues that impacted women, such as reproductive rights, domestic violence, maternity leave, protection from sexual harassment at the workplace, sexism, and legislation that defended women from gender discrimination. These feminists not only brought more awareness to the injustices facing women as a whole, but also highlighted the unique challenges that women of color faced in contrast to white women. A case in point is the story of Mexican American women activists in the United States who were known as Chicanas. The Chicana movement emerged from the advent of the Chicano movement of the 1960s. Chicano was the term that referred to people of Mexican descent born in the United States. Notably, the term Chicano was previously seen as a term that referred to poor Mexican Americans who were low class and lacked education. However, Chicano identity took on a different meaning in the 60s. The term Chicano was reclaimed as a badge of pride for Mexican American students whose discrimination in public schools inspired them to become politically active in efforts to attain a better education. They responded to real concerns that ethnic Mexicans faced for decades in public schools in the United States. A case in point were Chicanos in Los Angeles County. So what sparked the Chicana and Chicano movements? Let's get a brief introduction from one of my favorite documentaries on this topic, Chicano, History of the Mexican American Civil Rights Movement.
1968 was a time in which the entire planet was feeling the reverberations of a new spirit. Certainly it was going on in Mexico. It was going on in France. It was going on all over the United States with students of every single state and college and town demanding that there was and had to be a better alternative to what was going on in the world at that time. The Vietnam War was a big issue for everybody, particularly for Chicanos, because we were dying there in higher proportions to anyone else, and no one was acknowledging that. So that our contributions didn't mean anything to the country. And we saw reflected in the world that people thought that something could be done. And we felt that we had to do what we could do with our lives as well. That was a time in 1968.
There was never a school term like this one. It began with a simple protest by students who wanted a better education. School officials became involved, and the parents, then the police, and the FBI. Before long, school children were branded as subversives, their lives threatened, all because they wanted a better education. Something was definitely wrong. Only 1 out of 4 Chicanos completed high school.
The dropout rate was really kind of what some people called a push-out rate. I mean, these were students who were being pushed out of school because their needs weren't being met, their culture was not addressed, the school really wasn't doing anything for them.
Unemployment was almost double the national average. Those who worked earned about 2/3 of what other Los Angeles residents earned. These conditions had a dramatic impact on Mexican-American children.
I started elementary school in the early 1950s, and I was the only student in my kindergarten class that was a monolingual Spanish-speaking child. And I was immediately led to the front of the class, and I was instructed on how to create a cone hat out of construction paper. The teacher painted a word on it and told me I could take it off when I learned to speak English, and the word she had painted on that was the word Spanish.
I remember going to elementary school, taking my tacos of frijoles and meat and rice and being made fun of by the other kids in junior high especially, to the point where I didn't want to take tacos de carne to school. I wanted to take bologna sandwiches.
There were clear signs of prejudice and discrimination.
I remember vividly when I was an honor student being asked by the white counselor what my father did for a living, and me telling her, well, you know, he's a laborer, you know, he works with his hands. And then she told me, and I'll never forget this, these were the exact words, that is a very honorable profession. You should follow in your father's footsteps.
My homemaking teacher, she would say, you know, you little Mexicans, you better learn and pay attention. This class is very important because, you know, most of you are going to be cooking and cleaning for other people.
It was real clear to me that there was a definite tracking system. Some students went into the academia tracking and were being prepared to go to college. Others were being tracked into going into the shop classes, into the vocational areas. It wasn't that there was anything wrong with that, but you didn't have a choice. You were tracked into those areas.
Instead of being ashamed about their ethnic Mexican heritage, those who identified as Chicanos during the 1960s brought new meaning to the term and wore it like a badge of pride. They proudly declared themselves as Chicanos, which not only referred to ethnic Mexicans born in the United States. In contrast to the term Mexican American, however, Chicano identity also came to symbolize someone proud of their Mexican roots instead of being ashamed of them. Additionally, Chicanos embraced their mixed identity as ethnic Mexicans on the one hand and U.S. citizens on the other. This is also the case today for Chicanos like myself, who continue to use this identity. Chicanos and Chicanas openly embraced their bicultural heritage by speaking a mixture of English and Spanish known as Spanglish. They showed pride in their indigenous culture by embracing Aztec and Mayan iconography, especially in artwork. Chicano also took on political associations for activists in the 1960s. Those who were involved in organizations devoted to gain civil rights for Mexican Americans embraced the term Chicano. The Chicano movement gained traction as a result of the blowouts of 1968, where Mexican American students staged protests and walked out of high schools in East Los Angeles and other parts of the United States to protest discrimination and to demand ethnic studies.
A massive walkout to shut down the schools was what we somehow decided on. Change wasn't going to come from within, it had to come from without.
How many people were going to do it and who was going to do it was, I think, decided that morning for a lot of us, and me included.
And at 9 a.m., while we were all sitting in class, everyone was aware this was going to happen.
The signal was going to be blow out, blow out. And so we went around the school and said, hey, blow out, blow out. So then all of a sudden kids began to come out of those classes and the teachers didn't know what was going on.
My friends would go down the hallway saying, walk out, walk out. And I remember looking at them and thinking, my God, am I really going to do this?
And then all of a sudden, the chanting began, Chicano power, Chicano power, ya basta, we demand change.
In the morning, as I walked into the school, as the bell rang for the kids to go to school, into the classroom, out they went. Kids from all over, different hallways and everything else, bam, out in the streets, with their heads held high, with dignity. It was beautiful to be a Chicano that day.
4,000 students walked out of 5 East Side high schools that day. By the end of the week, 16 schools were affected, with more than 10,000 students out in the streets. Los Angeles was only the beginning. Soon after the blowouts, Chicano students across the country staged similar protests, igniting a movement for educational reform that would continue for many years to come.
We were very successful at informing the public about how serious the conditions were. Also in getting our parents and other community people involved.
The blowouts made us all realize that, wow, collectively we had a strong voice, and it gave us a power that we didn't realize that we had before. And we knew that we were going to win, one way or another.
Many of the students band together and formed organizations that advanced the goals of the Chicano movement, such as MAPA, Mayo, Liga, the Brown Berets, and Mecha. Here at UTEP, Chicano students, led by groups such as Mecha and the Brown Berets, protested to demand ethnic studies and to make the university more accessible to the local ethnic Mexican population. Back then, UTEP prided itself as an exclusive institution, and some alumni even referred to it as Harvard on the border. Chicanos instead advocated for UTEP to be more inclusive of the local ethnic Mexican community, since the demographics of the university was not reflective of the local population as it is today. However, all these efforts were taking place, the women, the Chicanas, who were involved in these movements often found themselves sidelined. Their Chicano counterparts often took credit for the work that was done and accomplished. The men often were the keynote speakers at rallies, authored protest pamphlets, and often took high-ranking leadership positions. Commenting on this, Ana Nieto Gomez, a Chicana feminist writing for the newspaper Hijas de Cuauhtémoc, wrote in 1971, "Chicanas can no longer remain in a subservient role or as auxiliary forces in the Chicano movement. They must be included in the front line of communication, leadership, and organizational responsibility. The issue of equality, freedom, and self-determination of the Chicana, like the self-right of determination, equality, and liberation of the Mexican Chicano community, is not negotiable. Anyone opposing the right of women to organize in their own form of organization has no place in the leadership of the movement." End quote. Chicana feminism was not only inspired by the marginalization of Mexican American women in the Chicano movement, but also in their own homes. They questioned the traditional roles they filled in their families. They refused to be housewives who simply stayed home to rear children. They did not want to relegate themselves to domestic work as secretaries and maids. Instead, they wanted to go to college to make their own livelihoods in careers that were more fulfilling. They also questioned the value of hyper-masculine macho culture. I don't know why I said macho. They also questioned the value of hyper-masculine macho culture in the Mexican-American household, known as machismo, which they saw as a barrier that prevented Chicanos from succeeding in American society. Thus, Chicana feminists, like African American and Asian American feminists, were activists who fought on two fronts: the battle against racism and the fight against sexism. Yet, while the Chicano movement fought for liberation and opportunities for Mexican Americans, it was held back with patriarchal and even homophobic values. Dr. Yolanda Chavez-Leiva, a professor here at UTEP, recalls a particular instance at a conference held by the Mexican American Youth Organization in 1977. In her article, "There is a Great Good in Returning," she writes, "I had come out at 18, and my university years were marked with political activity as a Chicana and as a lesbian. I was often the only Chicana in lesbian spaces, and the only out lesbian in Chicana spaces. Those were difficult years. On campus, much of the leadership in Chicano organizations was queer, yet that queerness was largely invisible. When several of us challenged that invisibility in the Mexican American Youth Organization, Mayo, the group splintered under the weight of the controversy. In 1977, Chicano movement activists organized the first National Chicano-Latino Conference on Immigration and Public Policy. The conference, held in San Antonio, drew over 2,000 participants with political views ranging from radical to moderate. In the weeks preceding the conference, a group of gay and lesbian Chicanos and Chicanas, mostly students, had drafted a statement to take before the gathering. We asked that one of the resolutions call for an end to homophobic immigration policies that denied entry to homosexual immigrants. I remember standing in the back of the Great Hall as the conference proceeded, wondering who would take our proposal forward. We believed that it would have more credibility if it was taken forward by a professor, and looked to our allies at the university for help. After several professors declined, one agreed to take the proposal to the front of the room. As our resolution was read, there were snickers in the audience. When the person reading the proposal did an on-the-spot translation, he used the word joto rather than homosexual, and the audience burst into laughter. My memories of this great event in Movimiento history are collapsed into that one humiliating and painful moment when my own people dismissed the treatment of gay and lesbian Mexican immigrants with laughter and scorn. For years, I tried to forget that day in San Antonio." End quote. The Chicano movement of the 1960s and into the 1970s was then largely dismissive, if not discouraging, of female voices. However, this did not stop Chicana feminists from continuing to organize and form their own voice. Into the 1970s, the Chicano movement activists spoke and wrote about machismo within the movement and in the household. This did not come, of course, without some negative backlash from reactionary Chicano activists who accused them of being divisive and dismissed them as feminists. Alma M. Garcia notes that some Chicano movement activists even went as far as accusing Chicana feminists of betraying the Chicano movement in favor of the white feminist movement. They called them vendidas, or sellouts, for calling attention to the so-called white issues. In an interview with Chicana feminist Nieto Gomez, she recalls being told by one activist that, quote, "The familia, or the family, has always been our strength in our culture, but it seems evident that you Chicana feminists are not concerned with the familia, but are influenced by the Anglo women's movement," end quote. Sadly, these sentiments were not restricted to Chicana feminists. Black and Asian American feminists also faced similar criticisms from their male counterparts. Nanling Xiao notes that Asian American female activists were accused of, quote, "weakening the male ego, diluting effort and resources in Asian American communities." In short, affiliation with the feminist movement was perceived as a threat to solidarity within their own community, end quote. However, the claims made by male activists in the Chicano and Black Power movements about their feminist counterparts being co-opted by white feminists went ungrounded. In fact, these feminists of color even expressed their own disillusionment within the mainstream feminist movement. For starters, Blacks, Chicanas, and Asian American feminists were frustrated that many of their white counterparts did not see how overcoming racial prejudice and discrimination was important to the white feminist cause. This sentiment is captured in the Combahee River Statement, which has also been assigned for this week's reading. Secondly, class differences caused animosity within the feminist movement. Chicanas noticed that most white feminists were middle class and could not relate to Chicana feminists who largely came from poor and working class backgrounds. Chicana feminists did, however, successfully form alliances with Black and Asian American feminists who recognized the importance of race, class, and gender in their movements. As best stated by Norma Alarcón, during the 1980s, Chicanas breathed new life into the Chicano movement. Chicana authors such as Gloria Anzaldúa and Cherry Moraga embraced indigenous identity, Chicana lesbian experiences, and challenged the notion of corporate Hispanic identity. In contrast to Chicana and Chicano, Hispanic was a term that arose during the Ronald Reagan era in the 80s. Hispanic referred to people of Latin American descent with conservative values and who embraced assimilation into corporate Anglo-American society. Hispanic identity was a stark contrast to Chicano and Chicana identity, which openly embraced Mexican American culture as well as the political ideologies of the so-called New Left. Most notably, Chicana artists of all types of visual and performing media contributed to the representation of women and lesbians. Muralists like Judy Baca created public artwork that reflected powerful women, power of the community, and feminist themes. Irena Cervantes was another artist and muralist who used Aztec and other Mesoamerican iconography to represent Chicanas in urban settings such as Los Angeles. The evolution of the Chicana movement was also seen in academia. National organizations devoted to Chicanas and Chicana feminist voices in higher education began to emerge in the 1980s, such as Mujeres en Marcha and MALCS, which stands for Mujeres Activistas en Letras y Cambio Social, or women activists in, is a bad translation, of course, in letters and social change. Chicano associations previously dominated by men also began to adopt Chicana identity. The National Association for Chicano Studies became the National Association for Chicana and Chicano Studies. In the past decade, MECHA, one of the largest Chicanx student organizations in the United States, changed its name from Movimiento Estudiantil Chicano de Aztlán to Movimiento Estudiantil Chicanx de Aztlán. So this is the spelling of Chicano with the Chicanx with the X. Chicana scholars also began to widely published books, anthologies, and journal articles in various fields in the humanities, social sciences, and health-related fields, among many others. So what are some of the lessons learned from the second wave of feminism and the Chicana movement? One of the themes I also want to cover in this segment is the concept of intersectionality, which was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw. She describes intersectionality as a metaphor to describe how we as human beings deal with multiple experiences based on various factors, such as race, class, gender, and sexuality. Feminists have embraced this view to coin themselves as intersectional feminists. An intersectional feminist recognizes how women face multiple oppressions, not just as women, but also due to their race, class, and other factors including sexuality and ability. One could say that the Black, Chicana, and Asian American feminists from the 1960s and 1970s were ahead of their time in recognizing intersectional oppression on the basis of race, gender, and class. Those who were lesbians also recognized a fourth axis of oppression, which was discrimination based on their sexuality. Intersectionality, however, goes beyond just looking at oppression based on gender, race, and class, but also other types of oppressions. For example, women of color with disabilities might not only find themselves discriminated on the basis of race and gender, but also because of their abilities. A woman of color who is undocumented also faces discrimination based on the status of her citizenship. Intersectionality, then, is a term that embraces these multiple forms of oppression. In hindsight, this concept captures the experiences felt by women of color during the second wave of feminism. One of the contributions and legacies of the second wave of feminists of color is, then, the recognition that women may experience various forms of oppression, such as racism, classism, and homophobia, beyond the confines of gender.